My name is Jennifer Gray Thompson, and I am the CEO of After the Fire. Welcome to the podcast, How to Disaster: Recover, Rebuild, and Reimagine. In this podcast, we bring you the very best practices, best hearts, and great ideas from other disaster-affected communities. Thank you for joining us. Once again, thank you for joining us. Today, we have a very special guest, and I know I say that every week, but one of the goals of this podcast is to bring you just this ecosphere of what I consider super wonderful human beings that I have encountered along the way of working in the field of disaster. This one was many months in the making. She's a very busy woman. Michelle Luckett is with us today, and she is the CEO of Brace. Brace stands for Be Ready Alliance, Coordinating for Emergencies. And you'll have to forgive me if I'm looking over here a little bit for our script. You know, we're having one of those technical difficulties, but it's not a disaster, so we're going to be just fine. Michelle has over a decade of experience in the disaster sector, and she just joined Brace, which was founded 14 years ago. It helps to coordinate disaster preparedness, response, and recovery. So we have a lot in common. I actually met Michelle through Fannie Mae at Fannie Mae headquarters about 3 years ago. We were both there to speak together, and then I was very fortunate that FEMA asked me to go out to Hurricane Michael in Florida, in the Florida Panhandle, and address and convene with a group of disaster professionals. And it was there that we really sort of cemented our affinity for each other. There's an entire world of super cool people out there, like Cherry Jokum and like Dr. Lopez, who, you know, show up and who are just such a pleasure to know and work with. So I invited Michelle on today to really talk to you about, you know, how did she even get into this field? And when I first met her, she was the executive director of the long-term recovery group in the Florida Keys. And since then, she's moved to Pensacola County and has taken over the role of CEO of Brace. She's perfect for that kind of work. I'm really curious to talk to her about some of the things that she does, how she got here, but also what might the challenges be that could be addressed in cross-pollinating the specific areas in wildfire. Because wildfire is not wind and rain, and a lot of people have, you know, decades upon decades upon decades of experience in wind and rain. But the field of megafires is really only about, I would say 4 to 6 years old. We got a hint of it in 2015 with the Valley Fire, and then really a full introduction in 2017. And it's just been a real challenge since then. But I always love sitting with people in this field that I highly respect. And I'm so excited to welcome Michelle Luckett to the podcast. So thank you for joining us. Once again, thank you so much, Michelle, for being here.
Oh, Jennifer, I'm thrilled to have the time to talk to you.
So I feel really fortunate to know this group of disaster professionals. It just so happens to be inhabited by a lot of kick-ass women, and I definitely put you at the top of that. I can't wait until we can actually meet together again in person. And I just wanted to check in with you, like, what are the last 2 years? You've had so many changes in your career. So tell me what's going on with you in the last 2 years. We're going to start there, because when I met you, you were the executive director of the long-term recovery group in the Keys, Florida Keys, and now you are the CEO of Brace. And so if you could tell us a little bit about how that's been, and then talk to us about Brace, because it's very cool. I really like this model.
Great. So I took over as CEO here with Brace in November of 2020. And the founding CEO, Greg Strader, retired. And, you know, it was a great opportunity to continue doing the great work that I did down in the Keys, as far as hurricane recovery and working with the VOAD partners, the voluntary organizations active in disasters, and, you know, continue building on something I have a huge passion for. Brace has been around since 2006. It originally started off as the Escambia County Long-Term Recovery Group. And then Hurricane Ivan happened, and then Hurricane Dennis happened. And this community realized that they needed to really have a long-term sustainable disaster services nonprofit. So Greg came in and started building this organization. And today we have a team of 27 here in Pensacola. We have an AmeriCorps Vista program that is the largest disaster services program in the Southeast, with 18 Vista slots and a team leader. And we've got offices just outside of Tallahassee and a little rural community called Quincy, just outside of Jacksonville in Nassau County. And we are adding 2 to a nonprofit partner in Tampa Bay that is still doing Hurricane Irma recovery. So Brace really has, 4 main focuses, and it's those 4 R's. It's the readiness, the response, the recovery, and then the resources. And so for readiness, we handle all of the community training for the CERT programs for Escambia County. We have a really strong CERT program here in the Panhandle, and our CERT, what
just
that
in
is,
case somebody doesn't know, I know what it is, but I always want to assume that people don't necessarily know all the acronyms. So can you?
Sorry about that.
No, sorry, all good.
So CERT stands for Community Emergency Response Team. And the CERT program was established actually because of the earthquakes in Mexico City. And then it really solidified it here in the States in Southern California after the wildfires in the mid to early 1980s. And so this program evolved out of the wildfire response that communities were doing to take care of each other before the first responders could get on scene to provide assistance. So that program has grown exponentially around the country. There is a national CERT association. A lot of states have CERT associations at the local level. And so we are grateful that we've got a really strong partnership with the CERT programs here in the Panhandle. Most people don't realize that, from one end of the state of Florida, where I am here in Pensacola, down to Key West, it's a 15-hour drive and 2 time zones. So the Panhandle here is about 6 hours across from Pensacola to Jacksonville. And the communities are very different because they're very rural. So the other part of that is that we are the bullseye for hurricanes. And so having a local community emergency response program is a significant part of the readiness component of our communities here in the Panhandle. So we do that. We do specialized training for senior citizens. We run a great youth engagement program and have got fantastic partners. We're looking at bringing in a Camp NOAA program, which is about mental health trauma support for young kids, and to really help them move through the life consequences after a disaster. And that's a once in a lifetime experience that's done with Lutheran Disaster Response. And so we've also got a huge veterans engagement program where we work closely with Team Rubicon to get the veteran community involved. Pensacola is home to the Naval Air Station, which is home to the Blue Angels. So we've got a really big military presence. And just down the coast from us, we've got Eglin Air Force Base, Hubert, and of course, then Tyndall in Panama City. So the retirement community here from the armed services, they have a servant's heart. I mean, that's why people join the military, is to give back to the country. And so we really are happy to embrace those veterans and bring them into the volunteering work that we do. So that's the readiness. Then on the response side, we work very closely with the Escambia County Emergency Management to support the Emergency Operations Center. So as you know, there are the different support functions. So everything from, you've got mass care and liaison with the National Guard and all that stuff. So we handle what is known as ESF, or Emergency Support Function 15, which is volunteers and donations. That program those responsibilities mean that for any group coming into our community, whether they be an affiliated VOAD or voluntary organization partner, or a individual that's with they just got a truck and they want to come help, that spontaneous volunteer that shows up. We've got, we run the Volunteer Reception Center in partnership with Pensacola Christian College, which is a huge campus, to get folks involved in a way that doesn't create a level of chaos after the disaster because people self-deploy.
Yeah.
So that's
and then they accidentally duplicate and yeah, it's and not that and I think it's important to say that emergent leaders are the secret sauce in disaster, but coordination is the key to even dealing with that. So
absolutely. So we're very fortunate here that our nonprofit community, when it comes to response activities, really does not silo. We've got the long-term recovery group here in Escambia County is still administered by Brace. We have 120 active partners from this community, everything from social services to faith-based organizations to the local collegiate system to the school district. Everybody is involved in some fashion or form with the volunteers and donations component. So that's a big part of what we do. And I'm grateful that we are funded by Escambia County government to really fulfill those roles. And then on the recovery side, so we've got readiness, we've got response. On the recovery side, currently we administer the Hurricane Sally disaster case management program. It is a locally led program that was done with philanthropic dollars, both for the staffing model that is partially done through philanthropy, but is supported by a displaced workers grant from the U.S. Department of Labor.
Okay.
And we can talk about more of that if you'd like in a minute. And then we have raised with our nonprofit partners $1.1 million for unmet needs in this community. And it's not a big market like a Tampa Bay or Jacksonville or Birmingham or Atlanta. This is little Pensacola. So the fact this community and the partners all came together to pull those resources is significant. Hurricane Sally happened in September 2020, right as we are coming out of the pandemic. And so ways that we do recovery work as far as conducting needs assessments and case intake and all of those things that require face-to-face contact with clients had to be pivoted to embrace the new COVID protocols and realities of working with disaster survivors. The recovery is a big part of what we do here. And then the last R, of course, is resources. My job is to pull as much best practices and support from national organizations, best practices that we learned, through organizations like yours about, how do we do wildfires here? Because we do have wildfires here. So, but there are things that people don't consider until it happens. So my job on the resources side is to bring best practitioners into the community to really share what they do, educate the population, prepare the community. And through all of that, then we look at resiliency and, what does it mean to be a resilient community in an era where climate change, climate adaptation, whatever you want to call it, is a significant reality, especially in the state of Florida.
Oh, yeah. We think about Florida often when we're not thinking about the American West. But as far as like the ground zero, really, for so many of the wind and water issues, like most people think of Hurricane Katrina, and I think of that too. And I think of Louisiana. But when I was in Florida a few months ago and I was driving from Cocoa Beach to Orlando because I met family there, and I was like, wow, there's the job there is to keep the ocean away. Right. Is to deal with this, and water is just the strongest element. And in a way, like, it made me like, I really think about that in a way that I don't think that I had quite considered the same way before, but also we often feel so overwhelmed by the fire monster. And
Right,
but I was like,
right,
I think we can do that though. Like, I think we can we can live alongside wildfire, just like you all have to live alongside water. It's really what kind of interventions there are, what kind of technologies, how we're willing to adapt as humans to not be taken out by Mother Nature, because she's definitely not going first. That's for sure.
right, right, right.
And so I was just really struck by that. And I just think it's so important that we have these cross disaster sector conversations. And I am really interested to learn more about the wildfires you have there, but there's so many things that you just said that I would like to, talk about. But one of the things that I was really interested in was you were talking about the importance as a business, like a lot of businesses. And so we deal with a lot of residential issues, but also we care a ton about the private sector, especially
Right.
small businesses. Can you talk about not only the role and responsibility of small businesses, but what resources are out there so that they can stand themselves back up? In our case, in wildfire, to be clear, it's often that those businesses we don't have anything left at the end, but there
Right.
are a lot of businesses on the outskirts of these mega fires that have to make, have to have some of the same considerations. So I was very interested in your conversation around that. If you could talk to our listeners.
Sure. So I think, well, there's a couple of action items that small businesses can do, of course, in preparation for disaster season, whether it's tornadoes or fire or hurricanes, or that your community floods when you've got 5 days of rain. It's the ongoing business continuity planning, that COOP plan. But also in that are the readiness and preparation things that you don't think about until after the fact. Did you do an insurance check for your building? Do you have,
hold on right there. Don't even move past that for just a minute, because over and over and over again, the insurance issue, we don't do insurance because we defer that to people who are much smarter than we are in insurance, but it is so heartbreaking, the insurance piece. And also ask your employees, are you a renter? Do you have renter's insurance? And if you don't, let's look at your phone. It may seem like an overreach, but if your employees are displaced because of a natural disaster, like their ability to get back on their feet may make the difference between whether or not you have that employee next week.
Right. Well, and the other part of it, to be quite frank, is that, here and I'll speak to what I know best, which is here in the Southeast. When a disaster happens, if a small business does not have a continuity plan and a disaster hits, 70% of those small businesses in that community do not reopen. And of that 30% or so that do reopen, half of them will be gone within a year. So if you're a small rural community, as we have here in the Panhandle and across most of Florida, that happens, it's a community killer. It's a community killer economically because of what you just said. People can't get back to work. They don't have a place to live, so they're going to leave. So you've got not just displacement of an employee, you've got a displacement of an entire community. And what is a challenge for me in my work is getting that message out that some of this is avoidable. You can plan and prepare for business resiliency by just taking a few steps once a quarter to do an insurance checkup, to talk to your employees about their readiness and preparation. Do they know where they're going? Do you have a contingency plan if the internet goes down? Do you have a contingency plan if the cell towers go down? How are you communicating with your employees? Do you have a displaced location where you can stand up your business if you had to because your building is destroyed? A lot of that is conversation that can happen ahead of time. But the challenge with entrepreneurs, as you and I both know, is that you get so busy in the day-to-day and worrying about your employees and paying your bills and this, that, and the other, that those critical planning moments tend to wait, they get put off. So one of the things we're doing with the Chamber of Commerce and some of our banks here is we're putting together a new business continuity BERT bag, if you will.
Nice.
And it's bright and it's orange, and it's going to have a list in there. Here's all the things you need to do, and put all those documents in this. Yeah. So when something happens, you grab that, you lock your building, and you go. But then after the fact, you've got your insurance information, you've got your banking information, you've got a flash drive that's got all your inventory and all of that in there, so you know what to do.
And just side note, I think this works in every disaster. Just right. Once a year, just walk around your business and videotape it on your camera. Absolutely. And throw it up in a cloud. Like, don't just take 10 or 15 minutes, because we've got to do that for inventory reasons. Well, right. That's the same in wind and rain too. And it's one of those very simple, not a drain on your resources or your time or your energy. And, but every single year do it, because you don't really think in your brain the incremental changes that your business or your home may have undergone over the course of that last year, but right. They really have. And open the drawers.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So that's on the readiness side. After the event, if you've got all these documents ready, then applying for your SBA disaster loan is not insurmountable. You've got your documentation, you've got what you need to have, because it's all in that one location, and you just took it with you, so that you can not only file your FEMA claim as an individual, but you can also start your SBA process as a business. And in the meantime, while you're doing that, hopefully you've got a nonprofit in your community that can say, listen, let us help you, whether it's the Small Business Development Council, the local Chamber of Commerce, to give you guidance as a business owner. Where do you put your energies? Do you put your money in your personal recovery and deal with that first? Or do you put your money in your business development and try to get that back up and standing? But when you do that, your personal recovery doesn't happen. And you and I both know that you've got to have peace somewhere in this process, or the burnout happens even faster. So having that plan in the community of who to turn to, what's the prioritization after the event to get reopened. In the meantime,
do you think though, Michelle, that you almost need like an A-B plan though, because you don't really know what's going to be destroyed. And as much as I love all of our partners at FEMA and SBA, I think people have to know in advance that, FEMA individual assistance is not a given. We have, in our case, FEMA has denied individual assistance to the Caldor fire, because what they said was, sure, you're a federal disaster, but you have too many wealthy people in your county that didn't lose their home. So never mind that 70% of people who did lose their home are uninsured, not uninsured, because they couldn't afford the FAIR plan. So make sure that you're looking at the actual, and they have also refused them a housing mission. So both. Right. So individual assistance, not a given. And it's good to know that, you should register, but know in advance that may not come true. SBA, love them. They did a miraculous job during COVID. But from a wildfire perspective, they regularly deny 80 to 90% of every single application. And then sometimes the appeal process is 3 to 4 times and very difficult. So if you know these things in advance, you are not re-traumatized. You are ready to deal with them. But we have to be very clear and open about what that process really can look like, and all of the different pieces that can come to play dependent upon your disaster. And again, not dissing FEMA or SBA. It's all about stopping fraud. And I understand that. But people, if they knew in advance, I think they would do better.
I agree.
I'm a Debbie Downer.
That's from the business side. But there's something that every state can do that most people don't take advantage of until somebody else says it, and then the window for application has expired. And that's the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act's Displaced Workers Grant. But that requires that emergency management notifies the governor's office through whatever state, and then the governor's office requests it from the U.S. Department of Labor, and then they make the award. For us, we did not get a federal disaster case management program approved by FEMA. It didn't even make it off the desk in Region 4. Just didn't happen. So I had just come into this position, and Governor DeSantis announced that $5 million was being awarded for Sally displacement. Well, I'm like, that's how I'm going to staff my case management program.
That is so smart. Okay,
So,
seriously, you have just unlocked a puzzle piece for me. I'm not even kidding. This was my big learning moment of the day. Go ahead.
Awesome. So under the Displaced Workers Grant, the deal is there's some qualifiers for employment. The first one is, of course, you have to have been displaced. So you got to have lived in the community that's been impacted, number one. Number two, you have to be able to prove that you have lost employment because of the event, or that you have been, your business has dropped so significantly that you are now underemployed, okay? And then another one could be that you have been unemployed for 6 out of the last 12 weeks. So you've got, by definition, long-term unemployed going into it. The entire purpose of the grant is to get people back to work and get communities stood up. So under this program, you can hire temporary disaster workers. Those workers can also be laborers. So what happened in June of this past year, we had submitted a paper to the Florida Department of Economic Opportunity, which is our DOL equivalent. And because they asked for some feedback. And I said, hey, you're missing the mark on this grant. Because it's great. I'm sorry, I got hair in my face. The grant is great because I can hire people. But what the real need here, because Sally was a wind event, is we've got debris everywhere. And so under this grant, that the disaster workers could only work on government property or nonprofit property. So I made the argument that in our communities here in the Panhandle, that's less than 7% of the real estate digest. It makes no sense if you're trying to stand a community back up. So we sent the appeal and said, you really want to make a difference? Let us work on residential property with a hold harmless agreement in partnership with the county municipal governments and their public works divisions. And, I honest to goodness didn't think it was going to fly. Well, it did. And they came back and said, you can do this. So this week we've opened a new office behind our office here. And we've got a program manager. We've got 2 crew supervisors, and we're in the process of hiring the laborers. We have agreements with Escambia County and Santa Rosa County to do debris removal. The problem, Jen, with this right now, if I'm totally transparent, is that it's 18 months after the storm, 15 months after the storm. This could have happened had the grant been adjusted to happen right away. So now the great news is that moving forward, that is an option that grant applicants can ask for.
Well, I think so. We have to take a commercial break, but I just want to say that I would like you to send me anything you can on that, because we too, yes, it's 18 months after, and also you're dealing with compound disasters at once with COVID, and you have to build in resiliency. So you have like 3 things that you're looking at. So while it may be, many months later, the fact that you did it and it set precedents, like I need people to hear that this is how we change the space of disaster to serve people better, is to have the tenacity to stand up and say, here's what I need. Here are the facts. Like you always want to back it up with facts,
right?
But also like, here's the possibility of how you can actually meet this community where it's at, as opposed to trying to serve 320 million people through one policy. And I really believe firmly that that is what FEMA and SBA and USDA and the EDA, that's what they're looking for, are opportunities to serve more effectively, but they are constrained. And so we have to help them through that by giving them the reason, so that you set a precedent means that I could take advantage of that in our world. So I'm going to do that. We're going to take a quick commercial break, and we will be right back with Michelle Luckett.
Fannie Mae provides mortgage options for you and your family. If you have a mortgage owned by Fannie Mae, you may have financial options available after a disaster, such as forbearance plans, deferral of payments, lending assistance, and counseling. Find out more from our disaster response network. Go online at www.knowyouroptions.com/relief or call 1-877-833-1746 today.
We are back with Michelle Luckett. She's the CEO of Brace, and I'm so happy to have her join us today. She is based in Florida. So today we're really looking at some wind and rain, but also just how do you do disaster resiliency, especially, serving small businesses, and they play an incredibly important role. So while we're looking at compound disasters, we're also looking at this sort of in recovery, not in the space of resiliency, but in recovery, we often see in rural communities, which we too serve a lot of rural communities. I'm very passionate about, helping remove some of the inequities and the barriers to their recovery. We see them struggling with that. What do you rebuild first, the business or the residents? Because it's an interesting chicken and egg issue. So you sort of touched upon that a few minutes ago. And I was wondering if you could come back to that and talk about what have you seen and what have you learned about when you're rebuilding a community? How do you measure when to build the business as opposed to, or in concert with the residences? It's a hard one.
Jen, I think that's the $1 million question of what we all encounter, whether we're dealing with a hurricane, a tornado, a compounding event where you've got a hurricane, a flood, and then inland tornadoes all at the same time, and communities are wiped out. So I think part of it is the mitigation efforts that have to happen ahead of time. Because that then helps the community understand that, it's not going to be great. It's not going to be fixed in 96 is something we talk about here in the state of Florida, meaning it's not going to be fixed in 96 hours. So you're on your own basically for an X amount of time. But the flip side of that is if the business community is prepared and they're active in the local co-ad, then Mr. and Mrs. Smith's restaurant at the town square knows that they've got 4 days of food that they've got to get cooked because we're not going to get power for another week. So then that relationship then builds on the local church that says, hey, we'll bring the tables and we'll set up shop. And then the community begins to respond. But by doing that, you're getting people re-engaged, you're reestablishing business. And it may not be that you're going to make a whole bunch of money right then and there, but you're building loyalty in the community that you live in. The best example of that was when I was in the Keys after Hurricane Irma. It was a Cat 4 storm. There was, 12 feet of storm surge in some parts of the island, and it just decimated the community. However, the local business associations immediately got the restaurants together and said, hey, what have you got for food? What have we got for supplies? Let's get this in, because in the Keys, there's one way in and one way out. It's US 1, and it's 2-lane the majority of the time. So if the road is underwater or the asphalt has been compromised and it's weak and it's failing, you can't move things around. And the Keys are 150 miles long. So going back to your initial question, I think a lot of it starts again with readiness and talking about resiliency, the partnerships you build in the community, and then the acknowledgement that small business owners are in a quandary most of the time because they want to take care of their community. They want to take care of their employees. As someone that employs a lot of people, it is my top priority. However, what do you do about your own recovery? And, the first responders go through it all the time. How do I do my job, serve my community, and at the same time, make sure that my family is prepared and ready, or in our case, sometimes evacuated. And compounding disasters here make it a huge issue because, as you mentioned earlier at the beginning of the cast, water is an issue here in Florida. The sea is not, it's not going to get any lower. And so in some parts of the state, we deal with a king tide, which means that the salt water is intruding the ground level. And what's coming up is not just standing water, but it's standing salt water. So emergency response vehicles will not drive through it because it compromises the integrity of the car or the vehicle. So that's a problem in normal time. Now you have rising sea levels, you have a water event with storm surge, you have a wind event as well because of the hurricane force winds. But then you move inland. For instance, if you're in Tampa and something is going, heaven forbid, going through Tampa inland, now you're going to have spin-off tornadoes. And so that you've got three things with one system that happens. So another example of a compounding disaster faced here is that Florida's the lightning capital of the world.
Oh, I did not know that. Look at that. There's number 2, Michelle.
We are. And the challenge with that is that we have a huge timber industry, huge, which was a problem after Hurricane Michael. And, everybody watched the storm land in Mexico Beach and the wipeout because it was a daytime landing. What most people don't realize was that they lost billions of trees in that area. And those trees go down on private property because it's an investment for a local farmer. And that, as you know, from out west, what happens when you've got dead trees on the ground and
kindling
and it's thunderstorm season and it rolls here. And so now you've got lightning strikes and now all of a sudden you've got a wildfire. And then, as you know, with wildfires comes mud. And we're not super elevated here, but there is enough elevation and there is enough lack of soil because there's so much sand that it causes sinkholes and it causes other problems. And so you've got all these variables that happen. I certainly am not discouraging anyone from moving to the state of Florida, but these are the realities that we face here.
I was amazed, Tim Carpenter from Fannie Mae, I made him drive me around for 6 hours the day before we all convened together. Because I was like, I'm not going to talk to a bunch of disaster people if I have not seen their disaster. And I was amazed at all of the trees, like hundreds of thousands of trees because they're not like redwood trees. So when everyone's, thinking they're probably like the width of me, like they're just like normal sized trees. They may be even, some of them are supermodels. I am not. And they just tip right over on top of each other. And it's kind of like you're just laying the field though for a massive wildfire. And it just looked so scary to me. I do know that Paradise, the folks in Paradise, including Charles Brooks from Rebuild Paradise, really led the effort on getting FEMA to approve with debris removal to also take out the dead trees. But that didn't even come into, I don't think they approved that until late 2019 or early 2020. So, wow, for the record, but it's a huge, huge fire danger. And unfortunately, there are, it's even political because you have some environmentalists who are like, oh no, the trees, they know themselves, they should just lay down in the forest together. And you're like, no, all you're doing is creating a secondary disaster in the making. Right. So it's not, none of it works that way. When we were in Oregon, in Central Oregon, a couple of months ago or 4 months ago or so, they had protesters who had stopped FEMA and the Army Corps of Engineers and the contractors from taking the dead burned wood out of the forest because they mistakenly believed that it should be left alone. So anyway, side notes, that's the end of my TED Talk. I keep going.
Okay. Well, I mean, that's really the significant part of the compounding factors here is, it happens. And so when you start talking about readiness and preparation, when you join my team, you take the FEMA class on fire mitigation, flood mitigation, hurricane mitigation. And the only thing they don't have to do is earthquake, because fortunately we don't have that here. But the understanding of what needs to be done to prevent a natural disaster from being a community killer is a huge conversation here. Pensacola was in the warning code for hurricanes 7 times in 2020, 7 times. So that means communities are standing up, standing down. Shutters are going up, they're going down. You're buying groceries, you're filling your gas tank. And for families that live paycheck to paycheck, that United Way, ALICE number, that asset limited, income constrained, employed individual. So it's basically that person that is living paycheck to paycheck, every time we have an event, they're now tipping into the little bit of reserves they may have to put gas in their car or to buy food or to, pay for a hotel because they're not comfortable where they live, or they live in a mobile home and they know they're not going to be able to stay in there during a storm. And so those compounding factors about, financial education, and it's not just about having your disaster kit, but it's about having, disaster resiliency in every part of your preparation. And that it runs the gamut in a community. So we talk about it every single day.
Do you hear, sometimes I hear this too. I think that probably a lot of us in disaster hear this is they'll say, or a reporter is often who asks, they're like, why should a public school teacher in Des Moines help to pay for resilience in Sonoma, California? And I'm like, because they're going to pay for it anyway. It's like, you want to pay 1/6 or 6 times. Like, it's really like, it's your call. So when I think about, like, when we see people in disaster who are just so suffering, and I wonder, like, I'm really hoping we move way more into resiliency, and that when you and I talk again, we're going to talk throughout the next decade, but a decade from now, when we're talking yet again, we're like, wow, this is so cool about how 3/4 of our work is in resilience. And so, like, what can be done for, entire communities? And you have the CERT team, which is great. But like, any resilience grants to build up their infrastructure for, so maybe one day a mobile home will successfully survive, a horrific event. I think about that.
I think some of it is, quite frankly, I think it's educating local elected officials on why it should be a priority now instead of after the event. Elected officials are passionate about their communities. They want to do the right thing. And part of that is our responsibility to educate them. And you do a fabulous job of carrying that message in Washington, D.C. There's nobody that does it better than you. And it's true. It's true. And so, I constantly,
thank you for that.
I take little tidbits from you on it, and then I drop it in my world here in Florida because it's effective. Having conversations that help those who make funding appropriations available have to understand. Having the emergency managers from around the state of Florida invade Tallahassee last week and do EM Day and have them all make the rounds. We've got 69 counties here. That's a lot of people. But there's one emergency management director for the state. And Kevin is great. His name is Kevin Guthrie, but he cannot influence political change for appropriations by himself.
Yeah.
It's local, it's emotional, it's heart work. And sometimes people forget, elected officials forget, that it's not just numbers on a paper, but we're talking about communities and making that change and allowing for more resiliency funding has got to happen. More states need resiliency officers. There's a great conference that the National Governors Association is putting on next month in New Orleans. And if you're not there, you need to be there. I'll be there.
I would like to be there. Send me the information. Are you going to be there?
I'm going to be there.
I'm free next. I actually don't have a trip planned next month.
Oh, now you do. And it's in New Orleans.
I do like New Orleans, and I like you, and I like governors, and I like emergency management. So all of that would be very interesting for me.
So it's going to be great. But that is, again, an indication that there is a change in the political temperature at the state level, recognizing that they have to do something about resiliency because it's not going to go away. And, we can, if it starts at the local level with support from the governors, then the message is going to carry a lot heavier in Washington, D.C. with those individuals that represent states and the interests of their constituents back home.
And I'm so actually happy to see even in these very strange times, it feels like the issue of climate change and climate resiliency is something that's becoming less politicized daily. And
I
it's
agree.
really because I think so much of it had to do with us being sort of held hostage in COVID and affected by that kind of like natural disaster, if you will. While then we were also, burning down or, wind and rain events and having sort of a front row seat to our vulnerability. And
Right.
once you get a front row seat to your vulnerability, some people, they will shrink from that, but there are just enough people who are like, yep, that's how it is. And guess what? We're going to lean all the way in and we're going to figure out how to make resiliency, something that we do together. And it's not going to look exactly the same in Florida like it looks in California, but at least we can agree on that. And that we are a bit at the mercy of Mother Nature. And again, she's not going to go second or first.
Right.
She's not,
Right.
none of that's going to happen like
Right.
that. But I'm so relieved to see this sea change from philanthropy, from politics to all of these things. And like nobody's really, and I'm so excited to see corporate America and the car industry in particular say, oh yeah, even if you don't make us do it, we're actually gonna do it because it also makes financial sense, where to invest.
I think it's a significant paradigm shift.
Yeah.
From the world 10 years ago. I mean, if we'd had this conversation 10 years ago, we'd have been laughed out of the room.
Yeah.
And
even
now,
3 years ago, I see a difference even from 4 years
right.
ago.
Right.
Just this, like people are like, oh, I don't know about climate change. Now they're like, oh yeah, I'm pretty much, I see that. Yeah.
Right. Right.
Yeah. Wow, that's just remarkable. So say we have like 8 minutes left, and I want to make sure that I'm going to get everything in that we can do for this episode. I have a feeling we should probably just do this yearly because there's not going to be like an end to, how much we're, going to ever want to talk to each other, which is always going to be a lot.
Oh, it's going to be a lot.
It's going to be a lot. So the UN report that came out the other day on climate change globally is really terrifying. And for a lot of people, it's going to make them sort of, shrink away. Give me your like ideal case scenario. And then I'm going to ask you another question after this. So don't give me like a 3-minute ideal case scenario for how we should approach the next decade together, what the Nature Conservancy calls the determinant decade.
I think one of the most significant parts of it is to address the education component. I think the significance of the average person understanding the consequence of what's coming is huge. Sea level rise here in the state of Florida is significant. It is going to cost billions and billions of dollars in the real estate market in this state over the next couple of decades, if not sooner, given the rapid numbers that are coming in now, because the majority of the development in the state of Florida is on the coastline. Yeah. And so education is going to be important. Understanding that it is not a political issue. This is a fact. No. It is not Republican, it is not Democrat, it is not Libertarian. This is a world civil issue that has to be addressed. I think the world got a big wake-up call in 2020 when the globe shut down. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden, and I lived in Southeast Asia for 4.5 years, and all of a sudden communities that are laden with pollution have beautiful blue skies, and they see the consequence of a slight change in behavior and what that can do to the planet. So if we have a slight change in behavior in the modus operandi of an individual's responsibility in their community, and we take that and we seed it in a community, that change exponentially adjusts the resiliency of the community, because people then understand that it's not just, oh, my carbon footprint. Okay, it's a bit more than that. And you have a responsibility to do your part. And so, what does that mean as a educator, as a teacher? What does that mean as a civil servant? What does that mean as a nonprofit? What does it mean as a medical provider? I mean, every segment of this population, of our communities, is affected by what the climate is going to do. And the more we talk about it, the more creative solutions can be found and people can be less afraid. I really hate personally the fear factor that some organizations put out there. It's one thing to be informed and aware, but then be prepared. I mean, the acronym for BRACE is the Be Ready Alliance, coordinating for emergencies, right? So the challenge I posed to my board in the fall was, how do you define emergency? Because what it was when you were formed in 2006 and what it is in 2021 is not the same. The concept of alliance and the partnerships we have in our communities and the collaboration that has to happen in order to build a resilient community must be acknowledged, and it has to be tended to. You can't wait until after the fact to do it, because then you've lost your community and now you spend all this money and energy rebuilding. So again, I'm a huge proponent of readiness, preparation, dialogue, strategic thinking. It is what communities can do best to protect themselves in the future.
You know, when you talk about the politics or how politics are going to hurt us in the field of disaster, if they're not used in service to education, to everything that you mentioned about, we have to stop with magical thinking. And if I win, then you lose, because none of it's like that. And I was really struck. We actually had to reschedule this because of the Sunnyside condo collapse and your work there. And I found that just so profound watching it. And I thought, no one's asking, are you Republican, Democrat, Libertarian, Muslim, Christian? Nobody cares when they're trying to pull you out of a condo collapse. Like, they're not like, what they're looking for is how do we serve humanity in this really terrible, frightening tragedy? And
Right.
that's so much of what disaster needs to be, both before, during, and after. So I just want you to know that I thought of you. I can't imagine how difficult that was to attend to, and acknowledge that must have been like very rough, but also profound from my perspective, from very far away, thinking about, like, you were not means testing anyone, asking them their affiliations before they were receiving help.
The Surfside building collapse was a change in the Miami-Dade community. Miami-Dade has got fantastic nonprofits. I mean, and they do great work. Within 10 days, we stood up the case management program using local dollars, not federal funds from the Department of Labor, not state funds. We got the local nonprofits to pay for the case management program for 2 years. And we did that within 10 days. Within 12 days of the building collapse, that community inside itself and on the east coast of Florida and with national partners raised $8 million, because the consequence of the building collapse was not just on those poor souls that were lost in the event, but then the employees that worked in the building, the surrounding neighborhood that's impacted by 9 weeks of disaster recovery work and the entire area being filled with FEMA and state and mobile units and all this stuff. It's the Orthodox Jewish community that lost 60% of the victims in the building collapse were Orthodox Jews. And so there's a huge sense of loss in the community, plus the folks that were there internationally on vacation. Mm. And so now we're dealing with foreign governments and we're dealing with the State Department, and, all of these things had to happen. And again, because the community came together quickly and they brought in individuals who knew what to do fast, victims and victims' families were able to start getting the services that they need to begin the recovery process. For those folks, it'll take years. Yeah. The emotional trauma of it for the first responders was significant. The debrief sessions for the teams that were there was probably some of the hardest work I've ever done and I've ever been a part of. Surfside was a change in the game for emergency management in the state of Florida.
Well, I'm so glad that we touched upon that. And I guess that leads me to, my final question, which I actually like to ask just about everybody on the podcast. Doing this work is difficult. And, I was overlooking the Marshall fire in Colorado a couple of weeks ago, and I'm like, oh, there it is again. And then I came home and my neighborhood looks just like that. And I was like, oh, my house is probably going to burn down. And I'm like, oh, well, who's traumatized? That's me.
Just a little bit.
And it's hard because when you're a helper and when your job is to be a helper, like you don't really feel entitled to mental health care, but it's actually key to being able to do this work long term. So if you are comfortable, do you mind just telling our audience, like, how do you attend to your own mental health and well-being?
So, no, I'm happy to share. It was Surfside was difficult, and I walked away from it with a lot of emotions. I spent time in Bangladesh after the largest terrorist attack in the country happened. I was involved in a couple of different suicide bomb situations in that community, but none of that compared to the reality of sitting in a briefing, listening to what can and can't be done for families and identifying their family members. And so carrying that home, I got real quiet. So I've got some amazing support here in Pensacola. I've got several colleagues that specialize in somatic trauma response for first responders that are based here in Pensacola. Ami Lee writes the curriculum with SEI, which is a National Institute for Mental Health. And so we work through it and we do the debriefs and we talk about it, because one of the things we all do in this work is we're like, oh, I'm good, let me work. I'm good, let me work. And then you go home and you can't sleep, or you get a little edgy and you're edgy with the staff. And so I am a big believer in debriefs. I'm a big believer in follow-up debriefs 6, 8, 9 weeks after the event, because we get home and we get back in our routine, but the consequence of what we have seen, what we have had to do, for me, the big issue was I got there, I worked 12 days, and everything's a name on a list. There's just names on a list. And I am working 12-hour days and all this stuff. And so the branch chief for human services for the Florida Division of Emergency Management, Pam Hughes, said, Shelley, go take some time and go to the memorial wall. And I was like, oh, I don't know if okay, I'll go. And now those names are faces. And that name is a 8-year-old kid who's smiling and loving his dad and having a great time at the beach. And I know what happened. And so that was super heavy and it was super emotional, on top of the fact that my sister lives 2 blocks away from the building. And so it got personal really fast, just as it is for you as you deal with communities that you have been around and been a part of your entire life. The work we do is hard work. It is, not everybody can do it. And I love it. I love it a lot. And unfortunately that I've got great family support and a good support system to help navigate what we've got to do to take care of our community.
I think that that's such a good takeaway, is you actually have to talk about it, and you can't have because this work actually has very little room for heroes and saviors. And if you never mistake yourself for one, then it makes it much easier to talk about it.
Right.
But it's tough. And I think that we just have to always, I just think it's so important that we talk about it. And I'm so grateful to have, again, just this community of people who've been delivered unto me as the result of disaster. And I count you as a huge blessing. I'm so glad you're in this work. And I would love to see you next month. So send that over to me. And I look forward to our next conversation. I just really want to thank you for being on the podcast today.
Oh, it's wonderful, Jen. And I look forward to seeing you soon.
Okay. All right. Take
All right.
care. And
Take
we
care.
are out. Thank you for joining us on the podcast, How to Disaster. For more information, please visit our website at afterthefireusa.org. And if you liked this video, please hit subscribe.
Navigating the recovery process after a fire is challenging, particularly with the additional issues caused by COVID-19. Fannie Mae is here to help. If you live in a FEMA-declared disaster area, you can request free assistance from our Disaster Response Network. Fannie Mae, in partnership with Maury Management International's Project Porchlight, launched the Disaster Response Network in 2018. This program uses HUD-approved counselors to offer support. These counselors have been specially trained as disaster coaches. They address the challenges homeowners and renters face when recovering from a disaster. There's no charge for their services. The goal of the Disaster Response Network is to help people return to pre-disaster normal as quickly as possible. Clients are matched with a coach who work with them one-on-one throughout their recovery. In the initial conversation with clients, coaches review the status of the homeowner's recovery process, including current challenges, decisions that need to be made, and immediate long-term goals. They discuss topics like income and expenses, insurance, housing, credit or debt challenges, as well as aid or other assistance programs that may be available. This may include FEMA applications and Small Business Administration or SBA loans. The coach helps the client plan and prioritize the next steps for their recovery. Moving forward, the coach continues to be there for the client, reaching out to them regularly, at least monthly, but more often when needed, for up to 18 months' time. These regular check-ins provide the client the opportunity to ask questions, get help tackling challenges, and keep things moving as they work through their recovery. It's also where coaches can help identify new recovery assistance or grants that have become available, strategize new next steps for recovery, and talk through difficult decisions or priorities. One of the key ways coaches assist Disaster Response Network clients is by helping intervene when something has gone awry. Coaches will, with the clients on the line, call insurance companies to adjust their claims when costs exceed initial estimates, or call the client's creditors to request payment relief. The Disaster Response Network's approach ensures survivors have a personal financial expert working with them throughout their recovery. By helping minimize the financial impact of a disaster, survivors can recover more quickly. To get confidential disaster relief assistance, call the Disaster Response Network at 877-833-1746. Once again, that is 877-833-1746. Or visit knowYourOptions.com/relief for more information.